Okay, so this is the beginning of Unit 6. So Unit 6 is just the Civil War, so it's not a lot of years and time that we'll be covering. It's just 1861 to 1865, so just 4 years. But it is a lot of information that will be crammed into this unit. We're going to be going through lots of stuff, lots of names. So if names are something that you struggle with, then I suggest that you find a way to sort of make those pop out on your notes, whether that means to sort of highlight anytime I talk about a specific person, or start making sort of flashcards of people as we go through this unit. That might help you. We're also going to be talking about 19 different Civil War battles. I'll give you a chart in class that'll sort of help you keep track of all of these and sort of keep them all straight, but you will need to know all of them. So I will do my best to sort of make this process easy on you, but like I always say, make sure you're studying throughout the unit, not just the night before a quiz or the day before the test, because that's going to make it really difficult to do well. So let's jump right in. So where we left off was right with secession, starting with South Carolina, ending with North Carolina. And the thing that finally pushed us into secession, pushed South Carolina into secession, was the election of Abraham Lincoln. So Lincoln's elected in November and inaugurated in March, because back in the 1860s we were still inaugurating in March. So he was inaugurated on March 4th of 1861, and on March 5th, Lincoln's first full day in office, first full day as President of the United States, we finally get the final event that kicks off the war. So, and that's the battle at Fort Sumter. So Fort Sumter is in Charleston, South Carolina. And the commander of Fort Sumter was a guy named Robert Anderson. So on March 5th, Robert Anderson gets a message from Confederate leaders, basically Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, saying that he wanted them to surrender Fort Sumter. Now, just because South Carolina seceded doesn't mean that everything in South Carolina now belongs to the Confederacy. Any government-owned land or things still belongs to the United States because it's owned by the U.S. government. Military forts are part of that. So even though South Carolina is now part of the Confederacy, Fort Sumter, being owned by the United States government, is part of the United States. So it's U.S. military at Fort Sumter. And it makes sense that the Confederacy would want control of that since it's now sort of in their borders. So they're asking for Robert Anderson to surrender the fort over to them, and if they don't, they'll attack them. So his supplies are running low, food and weapons, and he knows that he can't just outlast an attack. So he sort of throws this over to Lincoln. And Lincoln has several options here. You know, he could turn it over. He could try to avoid a war here and just say, you know what, if you're going to go peacefully, take the fort, that's fine, and reassure the South that he doesn't want a war. Absolutely doing this would prevent Civil War. We wouldn't have gone to Civil War had Lincoln taken this route. But that's a very, very weak move, and it's his first day as president, and that's not the kind of precedent that he wants to send. At the same time, you have to remember that Lincoln doesn't even believe that secession is legal. So he doesn't even see this as a separate country. Remember, Lincoln will never one time in his life say the Confederacy or the Confederate States. He never said those words. He always called them the states in rebellion, because he never saw them as a separate country. So he does not choose that route. He knows that this also pisses off the North, and that's not something he wants to do. So Lincoln decides not to surrender Fort Sumter, but he also can't send military supplies to Fort Sumter. He can't send, backup or weapons, because what message does that send? It sends the message that he's gearing up for war there, and then once again he could be blamed for the start of the war. So what Lincoln does do is he sends non-military supplies like food and medical things to Fort Sumter to sort of help the soldiers that are eventually going to be trapped there, because he knows that that's what's going to happen. Now the ball is in Jefferson Davis's court. If he lets them get these supplies, then he can hold out indefinitely, and he knows that it'll be impossible for them to take the fort soon. But if he attacks them, then he'll be the one kicking off the war. So he decides to sort of shove this off on the Union once more, and he issues one more final statement saying that they need to evacuate the fort or they were going to destroy it. And then on April 12th, they did not evacuate the fort, so on April 12th, the Confederate military opens fire on the fort. So the Battle of Fort Sumter lasts for 2 days, and then on April 14th of 1861, the U.S. flag that was flying over Fort Sumter was replaced with a Confederate flag. So not the Confederate flag we see all over the place today, but the original Confederate flag, the one that I showed you, the historically accurate one. So that signals that the Confederates have won that battle. And so this battle is not technically the first battle of the Civil War, because what happens after this battle is what we consider to be the start of the war. But this is the battle that basically gets the war going. So after this, had Lincoln just said, okay, whatever, they've got the fort now, just let it be, then the war would not have happened. But he decides now to take action, and he summons up 75,000 volunteers to serve us in the military, to serve for a period of 90 days. And you're thinking, 90 days, what good is that going to do? That's not very long. And that's because Lincoln literally thought that in 90 days this whole war would be over. That's what the plan was, sort of a home by dinner time type of thing. They thought that this would be a small rebellion that they could squish in less than 3 months. We know that's not going to be reality. So this is when Lincoln's move here, when he begins to mobilize his military, that's when we consider the war beginning. So not every slave holding state in the Union actually seceded. There are several states who were not part of the Confederacy who did hold slaves, and they all border along the line between the Union and the Confederacy. So the 4 border states are Delaware, Kentucky, Maryland, and Missouri. So all 4 of those states did hold slaves and were a part of the Union. I'm not going to talk about Delaware that much because it is basically the size of Guilford County and not super important. But Kentucky, Maryland, and Missouri I will go into more detail about, because all 3 of those are very important. So these states are all not just important because we don't want to lose more states to the Confederacy, but they're important geographically speaking because they're serving as that sort of buffer zone between the Union and the Confederacy, and we want to make sure that that stays there. So of all of those states, Maryland is definitely the most critical, and that is because if you think about it, if Maryland was to secede and join the Confederacy, then what super important city is right beside Virginia and Maryland but our capital, D.C.? And then if Maryland seceded, D.C. would be completely surrounded by Confederate states, which would be very, very dangerous for the Union. So it was very important that they be able to hold on to Maryland. Now, just because Maryland doesn't secede doesn't mean that there's not pro-secession people in Maryland. There are a lot of pro-secession people in Maryland. So when the war gets going, a bunch of pro-secession people actually begin cutting the telegraph lines that go in and out of Maryland and in and out of D.C. to sort of try and cut Maryland off from communication with the Union, and also cut D.C. off from communication, period. Sort of a sociopathic thing to do, very creepy. They also start burning down bridges and roads in and out of D.C. and Maryland to try to stop any type of communication there. So finally, Lincoln has to send in military while he's trying to fight a war. He has to send in military to Maryland to guard all of the sites that had military value, ports, places like Baltimore, and things like that. And he basically institutes martial law. So martial law is when the military commanders are now in control of your rights, and your freedoms are going to be temporarily suspended. So during every war in American history, our presidents always feel that they need to make certain moves that may or may not violate the Constitution. Certainly moves that if they don't directly violate the Constitution, they come very close to violating the spirit of the Constitution. Lincoln's going to do that a bunch of times, and this is one of them. He actually forced churches in Maryland to fly the American flag by law, sort of trying to remind everyone what country they're actually part of. So in November, they had some more elections. November of 1861, they had more elections in Maryland, and Maryland officially elected a pro-union legislature, sort of setting in stone that they would not secede. But throughout the war, there will be pro-South people in Maryland, sort of trying to work against them. Missouri is going to be important because it controls such a huge portion and borders such a huge portion of the Mississippi River. So we know from the whole Bleeding Kansas incident that a lot of pro-slavery and pro-secession people live in Missouri, but the government in Missouri is actually going to be pro-union. So the pro-union government forms a militia to sort of, do their best to stay part of the Union and loyal to the Union. Lincoln actually sends troops there to help back them up. And when that happens, the pro-secession people, the pro-South people in Missouri, form their own militia. And they tell Jefferson Davis, and Jefferson Davis sends Confederate military, just like Lincoln does. He sends Confederate military to back those people up. So we'll actually see some civil war going on in Missouri. They're going to be fighting to secede throughout the war, but it will never happen. And then Kentucky, the last one, just like the Mississippi River is going to be important with Missouri, Kentucky is going to be vital because of the Ohio River. We'll talk about how all of those rivers play into Northern strategy in a minute, but Kentucky borders 700 miles of the Ohio River, which is going to be super, super important to the North. And if the Confederates gain Kentucky, then a huge chunk of the Union is going to be open to invasion. If you look at this right here, Kentucky also borders Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. Those are three Union states that would all be open to invasion from the Confederates if Kentucky was no longer part of the Union. Lincoln actually said, I hope to have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky. He knows that Kentucky is going to be absolutely vital to him being able to win this war. So the governor of Kentucky actually declares that Kentucky would not be taking a side in the war. He said that they would not fight Union and they would not fight Confederate. They were going to be sort of a neutral Switzerland there in the middle of the country. And Lincoln's like, all right, I respect your decision. Meanwhile, Jefferson Davis is like, no thanks. And he actually sends troops to invade Kentucky in September of 1861. And when he does that, violating their neutrality like that, he basically forces Kentucky to then decide to be on the side of the Union. So after that, the government in Kentucky will be pro-Union. As for the citizens in Kentucky, that state, more than any other, is going to be the epitome of the brother versus brother problem in the Civil War. There were families all over the United States that are going to be torn apart because of the Civil War, and a lot of them are going to be from Kentucky. John Crittenden, the senator from Kentucky who wrote the Crittenden Compromise, he actually had one son fight in the Union Army and one son fight in the Confederate Army. So that's a example of that. Mary Todd Lincoln, Lincoln's wife, she was the daughter of a Kentucky plantation owner. 4 of her brothers served in the Confederate Army. So Lincoln had 4 brothers-in-law that were part of the Confederacy. Awkward Thanksgivings, to say the least.